Hi. Now that we finished brain embryology, we're going to use that knowledge, especially of adult brain structures, to try to gain an understanding of how the brain is put together. Now, what was one of the first things we said? Let's not confuse the what? Cerebrum with the cerebellum. Cerebrum's going to be a big deal in this video. Here's what it really looks like, at least a sagittal view of the brain. And we have the cerebrum, cerebellum. They look pretty different. And in other videos, we will indeed talk about all of these structures. But this is going to be the star of the show. The star of the show. Let's get deeper into it. So, it turns out when we look at the cerebrum, it's made up of a couple of things. The cerebral cortex, also known as the gray matter cortex. Let's just talk about that for a moment. Gray matter, myelinated or not? Not. Very important. What part of the neuron is unmyelinated? The cell bodies and the dendrites. Here is the white matter. Which part of the neuron is associated with white matter? Axons, and they will be what makes them white? The myelination from, well, if it's CNS, the oligodendrocytes. And though we don't see it in this image, I'm trying to draw it, there's what we call basal nuclei. A nucleus is a group of cell bodies surrounded by white matter. That's what a nucleus is. The vast majority of the brain is made of the cerebrum, over 80%. If we look at this picture, we get to see something we talked about in embryology is the convolutions. The fact that in order to fit the brain into the what? Cranial cavity, it has to fold in on itself. And we have these ridges, which are called gyri, plural, or gyrus, singular. And what's in between two mountains is a valley known as a sulcus or sulci, plural. In some places, we have a really deep fissure. There's two of them I want us to know. One is the longitudinal fissure, which separates the left and right cerebral hemispheres. That's an L/R. And the transverse fissure, which separates, what's this? The cerebellum from the who? Cerebrum. Okay, that's good so far. Remember, when things are color coded, that's pretty much telling you you got different structures. And we have what it turns out to be 5 lobes. You're going to love this. We have the occipital lobe, the frontal lobe, the temporal lobe, and the parietal lobe. And how are they so named? Ooh, the bones that are superficial to them. And there's also the 5th one is an insular lobe. And you're like, I remember a sphenoid bone, an ethmoid bone. Don't remember an insular bone. You're absolutely right. The insula is a lobe that's actually deep to these other lobes. That's why in the picture in parentheses they're saying projected to the surface. Each lobe has its own function. So if you have a diagram, you should be able to tell me this is the occipital lobe. Function, I'll tell you right now, even though we'll do it again later on. Its function is vision. And then I could ask you, what's a disorder? Well, think about it. Is it lack of movement? Is it you can't hear, can't feel? Well, if its function is vision, then maybe blindness. That's a possibility. Altogether, all these lobes is dealing with this, going to be associated with the cerebral cortex, gray matter, and its big overall job is consciousness. And what is consciousness? You can write books on it, and even scientists are still working on it. But we could say at the low level, it deals with perception. I'll give you an easy example. Two people eat the same hot pepper. One person's mouth says, I can't drink enough milk to help me out here. The other person's like, where's the spice? That's a perception issue. They're having the same sensation, but the way the brain perceives it is different. Part of consciousness is the ability to communicate. It doesn't matter if it's through speech or writing, through some type of movement. It's all about communication. So someone else can gain an understanding typically. So understanding is a part of it. If two people don't have the same language, they will work hard to try to learn each other's language so they can get a sense of understanding. And then when all of a sudden you kind of gain an understanding, you're like, that's real cool. Appreciation. That's part of it, of conscious being able to appreciate. On another level, we'll see that voluntary movement is a part of the functions of this. So the question of the moment is, if you're having brain surgery, are you under anesthesia or not? No, you're very awake. Why? Because the doctor wants to make sure when they make a cut that they're not paralyzing you or anything like that. So it turns out they will give you a nerve block just so as they cut into your skull and remove pieces of it. You don't feel that. They could do that. Otherwise, it'd be very painful. Remember, isn't bone very innervated? And what you see here, all these numbers, which you don't need to memorize at all, are called Brodmann areas. Each one has its own function. So this is the Brodmann area associated with occipital lobe. Okay? And it turns out from one person to another, we all have a 17. However, it may be a little bit one way or the other, or in this. It could vary slightly. So there's no way of a doctor just knowing, boom, this is 17 exactly here. What the doctors will do is put a grid on the brain, and it's really, the grid itself may be reasonable size, but the space between the grids themselves, the individual squares, is very tiny. Okay? And it's an electrical grid, and what the doctor will do is stimulate different areas as the patient's awake and see if they still can move. Because they'll know that this Brodmann area is for movement of the finger or for hearing. Can they still hear things? Can they still see things? And it just, again, depends upon where they're doing the surgery is where they'll do the mapping. So a knowledge of this pays its weight in gold for brain surgeons. Okay? So these are your Brodmann areas. As we look at this, we'll see that everything you're seeing in this is what? Gray matter. And it's loaded with interneurons, which, if you recall, associate with both motor neurons and sensory neurons. And they help make decisions. Though I'm not going to go into it at all, the left and right cerebral hemispheres have slightly different functions. What I want to do for the remainder of this video is talk about the primary motor cortex. It's this red area found in what we call, and yeah, you should know, the precentral gyrus. And in case you're curious, yes, there's a postcentral, but that's another video. And what separates two gyri? Well, in this case, the central sulcus. The premotor cortex is loaded with pyramidal cells. They're multipolar neurons, functional. Lots and lots and lots of extensions. And what these guys are going to do is they're controlling somatic motor neurons. This is not the neuron that's going to innervate your skeletal muscle. This is known as an upper motor neuron, which we'll discuss more down the road in the next video. But this is going to control what we call a lower motor neuron, which innervates your skeletal muscle. So that's what I mean. It controls the somatic motor neurons. And remember, we said that every part has a different function and we can break it down into Brodmann areas. Well, let's take a look-see at that. Almost done. So we have in this picture, highlighted, so it's just shown, is the primary motor cortex. And what we can do is we could take this section out and look at it. This is the gray matter. This is the white matter. And look, if we look at this, it's actually, and I'm trying to show that as this, different parts from one little section to the next, to the next, to the next, controls different parts of your body. So we could kind of map it, and we call that somatotopy. We could kind of essentially map it and know. So again, if we destroy this area through a stroke, your toes can't move. If this area gets zapped, your fingers can't move. And look at the size. Look at the relative size. Aren't some areas bigger than others? Bigger than others. And what we can do with that, because this is real. There are some areas that are tiny and some that take up a lot of real estate. What we can do is make, and this is the coolest thing, what they call primary motor cortex homunculus. Instead of just looking, again, let's go back, at these little rectangles, which is hard to appreciate. I can see the fingers and the face being bigger, but what do we see in this picture? Look at the size of the face. Look at the size of the hands. What's that's telling us as a very easy visual is that there's a lot of the brain dedicated, physical area of the brain, of the cerebral cortex, dedicated controlling the face, which makes sense because of all the facial muscles and all the facial expressions. And what about the hands? How much mobility, how much precise finger control is there as compared to, well, the wrist and the elbow? Can the wrist and the elbow really do what the hand does? So a lot more of the brain is dedicated controlling the hand than, let's say, the ankle. So the relative size of the body part relates to how much of the brain is controlling it. Last thing. So what happens if the primary motor cortex is damaged? You lose voluntary control. You still have the lower motor neurons. You could still have reflexes, which are at the level of the what? Spinal cord. So if this is broke, we still have the spinal cord. Thank you very much.